It's great to be with you all. I remember last year I was giving my Paideia talk in front of a computer in a very small office, just looking at Mike. So it is good to be with you all in person. Not a bad thing to be looking only at Mike, but it's great to see you all, to be here in person. Blair and I think he left. There he is. We attended RTS Charlotte together, and we have many fond memories there and great stories as well. I'm very grateful for RTS and our colleagues, this institution, and for Paideia. I think this is a great work that Mike has put together. And I'm encouraged to see you all here. Anyway, I've only got a certain amount of time, and I need to get started. Okay, Augustine, virtue in the moral field. Any account of ethics, and here we shift from theology proper to an account of how that is lived out. Any kind of ethics that is worth its salt ought to include three important aspects: the location of ethics, the goal of ethics, and the agent of ethics. The location of ethics, the goal of ethics, and the agent of ethics. The primary aim of this paper is to explore these three features as they are expressed in two broadly construed viewpoints. I want to look at the ancient context of ethics and the modern, and this is going to be radically oversimplified, but I feel I've got good precedent in the work of Julia Annis in her monumentally important work, The Morality of Happiness, in which she does something similar, but in a very historical register. When we think about the character of the ethics of Aristotle, we can readily see these three emphases: location, goal, agent. And what we want to say is that the location of ethics for Aristotle is the city. He believes in a concrete city. This is the location in which we pursue a common good together, the end being happiness, or something called eudaimonia. It's a Greek term which means temporal happiness or human flourishing, but if you translate it literally, it means good demon. A conversation for another day. Eudaimonia is the end of ethics, and the life of virtue, this life of morality, concerns and addresses the agent's morality. The purpose of our brief time together this morning is to think about the contrast that exists between the way that Aristotle construes an account of ethics and one that we're very familiar with as moderns. I want to explore the contrast that exists, and then I want to introduce Augustine to solve all of our problems and to show us the way forward. Augustine picks up many of the same themes of Aristotle, but he extends these themes, he alters them in distinctly biblical and theological directions. And methodological approach I'm taking today is just to look at some of these things in his work, The City of God, which has been part of our reading in Paideia this year. From the outset, I want to be very clear that although the discussion spends a good deal of time looking at social, political, and ethical elements, the primary themes that we are addressing end up bearing a lot of theological weight. As it concerns our focus here, the burden will be to look in brief detail at the visible and tangible identity of ancient and modern contexts and the way that we end up living because of our place in the world. It's something that we tend not to scrutinize too much because we have bought into this idea that ideas do all the heavy lifting. We overlook our histories, our personal narratives, and our contexts. Theologically speaking, we have to insist that the world is a definite place. And that sounds very simplistic, but it opposes the modern myth that the world is actually this arbitrary space that we form by our own industry and by the exertion of our own will. Instead, the world is a definite place determined and governed by God. And as such, the world is theologically basic. Finally, it has theological ends written into the very core of its reality that affect our understanding and practice of ethical action. So to signpost matters here, I want to provide a theological interpretation of the moral field in which we inhabit, the end of our moral action, and the agent of our moral action, for the hope of making some sense of the pattern of moral activity that we want to practice, to offer a vision of human sociality that speaks to our ultimate purposes as being created by God, for God. So to begin with, and for instance, Plato going way back in time here. For Plato, the community was drawn by a form of the good, transcended the community, but whose form, when contemplated, supplied the content of politics and ethics to the philosopher king who led the city. In similar fashion, Aristotle also sees the location, the moral field, as the city. This is the ethical setting. But he differs in his conception of the good, which for Aristotle is not some transcendental predicate that's out there that has to be scrutinized only by the philosopher king. But for Aristotle, what he has in mind is something far more concrete, relevant, and tangible and visible to people generally. It is located in everyday life. It's less speculative. Both philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, view the good of the city, however, as an end that draws all individuals within public life to their ultimate goal, which is eudaimonia, broadly construed. And the way that it draws us determines the way that we live. There's an end. Dr. Smith talked about a teleology. There's a telos, an end, and we are all driven by that, towards that. One achieves eudaimonia, temporal happiness, or human flourishing through a moral life, which is characterized by the virtues. And in this moral life characterized by the virtues, what is yielded is an ethics that involves the shaping of one's natural desires away from our deficiencies and excesses, deficiencies on the one side, excesses on the other, towards a complete picture of goodness and justice. To draw the threads together here at the beginning, this ancient account of ethics emphasizes the social setting of the city as the context of the moral field in which a moral agent pursues the good through a life of virtue. This account looks very different to what we see and what we think about when we think about ethics today. What we see in the modern era. There is a social setting, but the social setting has shifted away from the city, the locale of the city, to the modern democratic nation state. Moral agency has shifted from an individual shaped and formed through the virtues in a community to an account of ethics that emphasizes right actions, proper consequences. Just do the right thing. Just do the right thing. Here we are indebted to Immanuel Kant, and gratefully we will not be dealing with Kant this morning. So there is also a shift away from an understanding of the good that draws individuals towards their created end through a life cultivated by virtue. That has shifted to a marketplace arena in which the good is that which is chosen by private individuals based on their own unobstructed preferences. Whatever you want for your life, pursue that. Make that your end, pursue it, buy it, get it, gain it, hold on to it. If we look at these three transitions just in a little bit more detail, we can begin to see just how far we have traveled from a picture of ancient ethics that we see primarily in Aristotle. First, in terms of the social setting of the modern democratic nation state, the cultural context that many of us, most of us inhabit as Westerners, is one that isolates individuals and then presents us, I'm not sure we are included in this, presents us with a surplus of options to choose from. Informed by an ideology that understands humans as independent centers of rational autonomy, we are presented with an inundation of material possibilities that appeal to every conceivable interest. And it is this wealth of choices that promises the most fulfilling existence. And long before many contemporary sociological analysts lamented the dangers and the toils of cultural consumerism, an earlier sociologist, Alexis de Tocqueville, worried that a democratic culture built on the foundations of an equality of conditions inevitably leads to a radical individualism and social atomism. He observed, not only does democracy make men forget their ancestors, it also clouds their view of their descendants and isolates them from their contemporaries. Each man is forever thrown back on himself alone, and there is danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. It's quite indicting. Well, Tocqueville's analysis was intended to convey a warning that an isolated and socially disconnected populace is more susceptible to the onset of tyranny. I think we can appreciate just how his observation both addresses a theological point inherent in modern accounts of liberalism, and how it also anticipates a particular social landscape. First, it identifies the idea that history can simply be discarded, which is not only an offense to our doctrines of pneumatology and providence, but it undermines the formative power of community and tradition. Stanley Hauerwas speaks directly to this when he writes, our assumption as Americans, and here I can comfortably just sidestep this, our assumption as Americans has been that unlike other societies, we are not creatures of history, but that we have the possibility of a new beginning. We are thus able to form our government on the basis of principle rather than on the arbitrary elements of a tradition. The second thing that is anticipated is a social landscape in which the common good has completely disappeared and been replaced by a good that you determine yourself, a good determined and pursued by a collection of individuals who are recognized as autonomous, self-legislative, rational, free agents. The moral foundations of this context are now built on individual preferences and privacy. In the modern Western context, people must be free to pursue their own preferences unhindered. And it is the job of government to distribute rights to enable people to fulfill their selected destiny without limitation or intrusion. I was wanting to say something about the don't tread on me stickers, but I want to leave here in one piece. The outcome of this model is the loss of any shared sense of what the common good actually is, which inevitably leads to the erosion of any account of public morality. By collapsing ultimate ends into the satisfaction of personal desires and appetites, the moral field is now occupied by people with no ethical horizon to draw them beyond themselves to something other, to a transcendent good. This shift in social context also produces a shift in the character of moral agency. The historical portrayal, broadly considered in the ancient Greek setting, recognizes the priority of the city to the person. You can't think of yourself without the context in which you live. As the old saying goes, you can't have a Mozart without a Vienna. We've got to take into consideration deeply the society that we live in. The historical portrayal, broadly considered in the ancient Greek setting, recognizes the priority of the city to the person, of the whole to the part, to the degree that a life lived without a deep participation in and dependence upon the local community was deemed an impossibility. In fact, as Alistair MacIntyre maintains, the classical view begins with the community of the polis of the city and with the individual viewed as having no moral identity apart from the communities of kinship and citizenship. In fact, in another place, MacIntyre emphasizes this point to the degree that the polis is the Aristotelian counterpart to the extra ecclesiam nulla salus, right? So outside of the church, there's no salvation. That's the kind of weight, moral weight, that the city bears for Aristotle. Aristotle explains at the beginning of Politics the reason why the city is so important. Just to rehearse this briefly, the reason why it's so important is because of the cultivation of morality. He says, we see that every city is some sort of community, and that every community is constituted for the sake of some good, since everyone does everything for the sake of what seems good. For Aristotle, the community has a shared understanding of the good. And this good is an object that generates desires within its citizens and propels them towards the good. The good for Aristotle, as we've already mentioned, is happiness, temporal flourishing, the idea of living well, doing well, which he explains is also our final end. Living well, flourishing, doing well, that's our end. Pursue that. And as you pursue that end, that will determine the way that you live. It will display the kind of person you are. With happiness as our final end, all our moral actions are directed towards the attainment of this blessedness. And our actions are given a rationality by this happiness. In other words, our moral actions do not make sense if we do not have a clear, comprehensive, and singular end in view. And that radically redefines the way we think about ethical action. It's also important to recognize here that while eudaimonia is something for which we strive, it is also something that we get to experience in our present moral activity. So what Aristotle has done here, and I've not done justice to him, but he has closed the loop on the final end and the activity of the moral agent. If happiness is one's end, then one's life must actively embody the end that is being pursued. It's not enough to have wealth, for instance, as your potential final end without also using wealth in a particular way. So you see how the end determines the way that you treat your life today. For Aristotle, it becomes a question of whether wealth is used well or poorly by the moral agent. And this is where the question, that the issue of virtues comes into the discussion. Aristotle defines virtue as a state that decides by reference to reason that it is a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. And it's important to note that Aristotle does not think that the virtuous life is merely a negotiation between two vices, but rather the moral life consists in virtue steering our given nature from what it is to what it ought to be, to our telos, to our end. Returning to our modern context, it's a common assumption, I think it's even held widely by theologically minded evangelicals, that ethics is about the business of helping us to rationally deliberate over doing the right thing, and that it should help us to solve moral dilemmas and difficult moral cases. I mean, teach ethics, the questions that we always want to hear is, well, what would I do if I'm in this situation? Because do I go to a wedding of a friend who is homosexual? I mean, those are legitimate ethical questions, but it indexes and maybe shows where our ethical reasoning is tethered to most, the moral dilemma. Not so much about the person. We'll get to that. Without rejecting the necessity and role of rules and outcomes, I want to be clear about that. We're not rejecting discussion and deliberation over moral dilemma. Aristotle in particular urges us to focus our attention on the kinds of people that we are, the kinds of people we are. Instead of simply addressing the external situation and looking at the kinds of actions and results that stem from these actions, Aristotle is deeply concerned with the internal character of the moral agent. And so before we turn our attention to Augustine to wrap this up, it is important to see how Aristotle's conception of the moral life is one that really does fit closer to a Christian account than it does to the modern, not only in terms of historical reference, but also in terms of its emphasis on character. In our democratic liberal context, the true ends of human life are obscured, which results in widespread confusion about ethical agency. Ethics in this modern frame rests upon obedience to a system of rules that will constitute procedures for resolving disputes as a people, and as this people pursue their various interests. I mean, you hear this as a common refrain: as long as the government stays out of my bedroom and out of my life, I will abide by this social contract. Ethics on this reading, well, I would say questions about character, internal motives, and virtue formation are not asked. They're neither investigated or expected. You follow the rules, you uphold the social consensus that we are content to be ruled this way. Don't hurt anyone, pursue your dreams unfettered, and we're all going to be fine. But by separating individuals from a common social history, blinding them from a shared common good, and reducing them to consumers who pursue their own interests in a maximal manner, liberalism today has given us a social reality, a moral field that views personhood, morality, and citizenship very much at odds with the ancient vision. And as I will argue, very much at odds with a Christian vision. So while the contrast between ancient and modern ethics is intended to cast a light that shows the distance that exists between both accounts, I also want to show how the ancient account, Aristotle's in particular, is far more companionable to Augustine's vision, with the hope of suggesting that it is Augustine who, building off an ancient account, offers us a far more potent corrective to our current situation and a far more faithful biblical guide moving forward. And yet, before we turn to Augustine, I keep saying he's coming, he is coming, I promise. I don't want to over-romanticize Aristotle. I mean, I'm trying to situate Augustine closer to Aristotle. But one obstacle that confronts any believer who wants to take up the possibility of embracing Aristotle's ethics, not that you're going to walk out of here and say, sign me up for, I'm one of Aristotle's guys. You've got to remember that the paragon of the virtuous life for Aristotle was the megalosukos, the magnanimous man. And for Aristotle, this is the exemplar of ethics. If you want to be as ethical as possible, find the megalosukos, the magnanimous man. This is the person, this is the man, it's very specific, who pursues a life of godlike self-sufficiency. That's Jennifer Hurd's description. This individual knows his own worth, understands that he deserves the public recognition that comes with his own value, and refuses to receive help from others. Doesn't sound like the kind of guy I want to hang out with. To become a person of magnanimity requires privilege, wealth, power, prestige, and a vast array of resources. It is a life of the elite and upper class. Aristotle says, the highborn and those who are powerful or wealthy are esteemed worthy of honor because they are superior to their fellows. And what is superior in something good is always held in high honor. Significantly, the magnanimous man inhabits a social context in which slaves, women, and children are all excluded from citizenship in the city. So think about the moral field for Aristotle. It's very restricted. Slaves, women, children excluded. So they can never obtain and experience eudaimonia. In other words, they cannot be truly virtuous. So virtue in the life of experience and embodying eudaimonia is for a very restricted group of people. Okay, turning to Augustine. We've got 7 minutes, let's do this. Okay, in his own way, Augustine shares the 3 elements of classical morality, focuses on the social setting of moral action, the end of moral action, and the character of the moral agent. But how he articulates these 3 elements indicates to us, shows the distance he is prepared to venture from an ancient model for the sake of bringing to bear the richness of his own theological vision. So Augustine shares Aristotle's belief that all ethical action presupposes a sociology. And while the image of the city figures centrally in both Aristotle and Augustine, one would be mistaken to think that they work in the same way, that they are identical. A closer analysis demonstrates that substantial differences between the 2 accounts are apparent. To start with, the social setting for Augustine is less straightforward than Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle views the city in a very literal way. It's a singular, literal, geographical entity comprised of real people. Augustine finds much purchase in appealing to the idea of the city, primarily because it is biblical, but also because it's a sociological entity filled with people. But in his hands, Augustine fashions a conception of the city in which the boundary lines are redrawn and the identity is reimagined in a rich theological way. Instead of one city, Augustine gives us 2 cities and imbues them with a spiritual and transcendent character that is tethered to and determined by our loves. Famously stated in Book 14, 2 cities then have been created by 2 loves. That is, the earthly by love of self, extending even to contempt of God, and the heavenly city by love of God, extending to contempt of self. The one therefore glories in itself, the other in the Lord. The one seeks glory from man, the other finds its highest glory in God. And the distinction that Augustine draws between the city of God and the earthly city, Augustine never uses the phrase city of man, takes its rise from a theological, anthropological affirmation, namely that at our core, we are made to worship God. Augustine refuses to contemplate a space, a neutral space, in which one might withdraw from and therefore end up repudiating convictions about the world in moral terms. Instead, people will either love and worship God or they will love and worship self. And from this insistence arises the claim that 2 moral communities, heavenly city, earthly city, form 2 kinds of moralities. One of virtue, one of vice, one of love of God, one of love of self. The heavenly city forms its citizens in charity and humility, and the earthly deforms its citizens by pride, superbia in the Latin, that leads to a lust for power and self-indulgence. For Augustine, the social reality of the heavenly city shapes the moral lives of its citizens. The moral field of the heavenly city includes those inhabitants who love God and is therefore structured primarily by worship of God. And three things quickly emerge from this account. First, the social setting for Augustine contains a common end that is inextricably bound to Jesus Christ. And it is this end that addresses our deepest needs. Worship of God brings about enjoyment of God. Dr. Smith talked about the uti frui connection. And there is no higher end than enjoying God in the heavenly city. It is here that Augustine shares with Aristotle a teleological approach to life in the city and is understandably, at times, classified as a eudaimonist. Yet eudaimonia is retranslated by Augustine as blessedness, and a blessedness that only God can give. The kind of blessedness that lovers of God experience in the presence of God. And while Aristotle has an immanence and temporal teleology that views the good of humans as temporal flourishing, Augustine's account of the good is directed towards God. And it's for this reason that while Augustine can be described as eudaimonist, he nevertheless, I think, avoids the charge that his ethics is egoistic. The end is blessedness in God. The way to that end involves humility and charity. So the end is blessedness in God. That draws us to God and forms us in humility and charity. Second theme quickly emerges, see citizens of both cities coexisting and sharing the same space in this present age. And it's at this point in particular, I'm excited to hear from Dr. Lee, because I think Christians have this sacred secular split. Augustine refuses that. What distinguishes the citizens of both cities are their loves and their destinies, not their zip code. There is no sacred secular split, no public and private precinct. This is a significant move because it forbids any thought that might suggest that one becomes more morally refined by retreating from a public setting, that you can wall yourself off. And if you want to see this in film form, M. Night Shyamalan's movie, The Village, captures this so well. There is no private space for the Christian because Christian citizenship is dual citizenship. The citizen doesn't live in two physical cities, but occupies a singular physical space while ensuring that love for God is prioritized over all other loves. This recognition of who we are as God's people helps us to see and to oppose the modern state's expectation that it has a monopoly on our loves and our allegiances. Positively, this recognition challenges us to be a community that perceives the gift of God's goodness to us and urges us to worship the triune God well. By doing so, the church can secondarily display and become a visible history of love and humility in the world as it makes its pilgrim way towards the heavenly city in its full and final expression, avoiding the entanglements of the limited and oftentimes wrong-headed projects of this world. And third and finally, if I can steal 2 extra minutes, the third and final theme that emerges concerns the genuinely public character of those of us who inhabit this heavenly city. Those that sojourn in the church, and just as a qualifier, Augustine does not equate the heavenly city with the church, so the church is contained within the heavenly city. Those that sojourn in the church live in a context in which the virtues of charity and humility are cultivated. And it is this that not only enables us to fulfill our Master's two chief precepts of loving God and loving our neighbor, but it also leads to the possibility of being a truly just society. Like Aristotle, Augustine underscores the social nature of the cultivation of virtue, but unlike Aristotle, Augustine judges Aristotle's ideal city to be deficient as a moral community in the same way that he judges Rome to be deficient, which serves as a joint claim for Augustine, which he makes on the basis that both cities, Aristotle's and Rome, fall short of being just societies. And as such, both communities are inadequate context for the formation of virtue. The only site that can provide true virtue formation is the just society in which proper worship is ascribed to Christ. As he says in Book 2, true justice does not exist other than in that commonwealth whose founder and ruler is Christ. So the sharpness of contrast between Augustine and Aristotle and Rome reveals a profoundly different approach to the subject of virtue. For Augustine, how does he think about the embodiment of virtue? Well, it does resemble Aristotle's that there's an end, there's a telos that guides the virtuous life, and he does address the agent who is involved in moral formation. But where we see Augustine depart is in the source that empowers and the enactment of the virtuous life. For Aristotle, the process of virtue formation is in the city, and it's through the act of habituation. So the moral life begins by practicing virtue. You become more virtuous by practicing virtue. So this moral life begins by practicing virtue poorly, and as you get better at practicing virtue, you become more virtuous. In other words, you start off by doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Through a process of habituation, you will eventually become a virtuous person. And anyone familiar with Augustine's interactions and engagements with the Pelagians will know that this is not exactly where he stands on the matter. His own definition is unsurprising, which you find in Lombard and picked up by Thomas. Virtue is a good quality of the mind by which one lives rightly, which no one uses badly, which God works in us without us. For Augustine, the source of virtue and the moral life is God. For he himself is the source of our blessedness, and he is the goal of all our desires, Augustine tells us in Book 10. He tells us that we find our fulfillment in him, and as we cleave to him, in whose spiritual embrace we are enfolded, our moral life is rendered, as he says, fertile with true virtues. The moral life is graciously given by God, it is decisively oriented by God to God, and yet it doesn't abandon genuine human agency. But significantly, our moral agency that we have is what it is only as it is evoked by God and sustained by God. Okay, final paragraph, I promise. If the shape of the moral life is determined, first of all, as a work of God, and we receive it as a gift of grace that draws us into fellowship with the body of Christ, then finally we can only speak of the moral life with a Christological reference. The intimate bond that obtains between Christ and his people is expressed by Augustine by way of the biblical idea that Christ is the head of the church, which the church is the body through the totus Christus. In this way, talk of virtues cannot be invoked without at the same time invoking Christ, who is not only the ground of our moral action as well as its end, but significantly, Christ is the model of our moral action. So while Aristotle's magnanimous man models a life of self-sufficiency and pride, Augustine's just man models humility and charity for us to see and to follow. So he's a model for us, but this is where the theological depths are plumbed even more. Christ is not only just a model for us, but Christ, through the Holy Spirit, inscribes humility and charity into each one of our hearts. So virtue for the lives of citizens of the heavenly city looks quite different. So virtue formation or ethical mimesis, we have to say it's not episodic. That is occurring in discrete moments. Without a constant reference to Christ, virtues can come to function as ends in themselves, which, as Augustine warns us, turns out to be vices and not virtues at all. Christian existence flows out of a new identity, and there must be a change in status before there can be a change in our conduct. Or to put it theologically, the theological must determine the ethical. So if the picture of the moral field that I've just sketched has any merit to it, then what we have in Augustine is a picture of the moral life that addresses the location of ethics, the goal and end of ethics, and significantly the agent of ethics. And while his account resembles an ancient model, Augustine is far more preoccupied with distinctly theological convictions. And when these are taken into consideration, they suggest helpful directives in thinking about our public witness, which is obviously beyond the scope of our time together this morning. It leaves us with a key idea that the burden of the church is to display the peace, humility, and charity that is ours in communion with the risen Lord, who orders our desires, directs them, and inscribes them as we live and hope for a city that is enduring, but is also in our midst. Thank you for the time.